box from WebEx, and I will be answering your questions at the end of the presentation. Also, after the presentation, we will send a copy of this PowerPoint presentation to all attendees, so you do not have to worry about taking notes from the information on the slides during the webinar. Having said that, just to get started, first of all, just to provide some information about VBScript and explain why InduSoft decided to embed VBScript in its development environment instead of other languages. So, first of all and foremost, VBScript is easy, flexible, and powerful, which is pretty much what we keep in mind when we add any functionality to InduSoft Web Studio. It has to be flexible, powerful, but it has to be easy as well. Easy to understand, easy to use, and fast to learn and to deploy. Also, VBScript has been around since 1991, so there are many, thousands, if not millions, of examples available in books, magazines, websites, blogs. So if you Google for VBScript examples, you have a wealthy library of resources where you can get examples, explanations, documentation. So you are not locked into one proprietary language created by InduSoft. Actually, you are open to a language that there are many users using worldwide, and you can share resources, share examples, and use them directly in the InduSoft Web Studio. Also, another main point that made us choose VBScript is because it's portable throughout all the Microsoft platforms supported by InduSoft Web Studio, including Windows CE Mobile, Windows CE, XP Embedded, Embedded Standard, XP, Vista, Windows 7, 2003 Server, 2008 Server, 32 or 64 bits, and on the web team clients as well. So we're going to see throughout the presentation, we talk about scope of development and lifetime for the variables. You can run VBScript not only on the runtime station where you run in the Web Studio, but also on the thin clients, even web thin clients when you use a web browser, Internet Explorer, to host the application. Integrating VBScript and built-in functions from InduSoft, we created a very powerful interface for SQL relational databases. And I will show an example here. I will create a few scripts during the webinar showing how to save data into the database and retrieve data from the database. Also, VBScript natively supports COM servers, so you can access properties and methods from any COM servers, even from ActiveX controls. And if they are graphical ActiveX controls, you can also write scripts triggered by the events from the ActiveX controls. And I'll show examples about those interfaces as well. Finally, VBScript supports procedures, which are functions and subroutines. And in the InduSoft Web Studio, you have many interfaces where you can create your own library of procedures, like the global procedure, graphics script, the screen script, and you can reuse those procedures, those functions and subroutines within the same project, or even share them, copy them to different projects. And the interface for SQL relational databases would be for any SQL relational database, Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, Sybase, MySQL, even a simple MDB file from Microsoft Access or Excel file. So any SQL relational database, as long as it supports ODBC, ODB, ADO, or ADO.NET. So before we dive into VBScript per se, let's talk a little bit about the internal structure of InduSoft Web Studio, because it will be important to understand the scope of development for your functions and blocks in VBScript. So InduSoft Web Studio has two main processes during the runtime. One is called StudioManager.exe, where you have most of the tasks, threads that are executed during the runtime. When you run the application, all the tasks set as automatic are executed within the Studio Manager process, and each one of those tasks is one thread that runs in parallel to each other. The viewer, the graphical interface, the module where the screens are displayed, where the user interacts with the application, the whole graphical interface is managed by another process called viewer.exe. And this process communicates with the core runtime through TCP/IP. And it gives us a lot of flexibility to run the viewer module locally on the computer where the core runtime is running, but also from remote stations. And that's how the thin client solution from InduSoft Web Studio works. You just run the graphical interface in a remote computer, either as the secure viewer.exe or hosted by a web browser, and they connect to the main runtime modules through TCP, through the TCP/IP server thread from Studio Manager. And Studio Manager is a multi-thread system where we have several tasks. I just illustrated some of them here. And one of them is the background task, which has actually several threads within this task, including trained, alarms, rescues, reports, math, scripts, and scheduler. So here in the Studio Manager, this module runs on the server only, on the runtime station where you install InduSoft Web Studio, and the viewer.exe can run locally on the same computer for the local visualization, the local graphical module, or from a thin client as well. But they are independent processes that exchange data with each other through TCP/IP. And this architecture brings a lot of advantages. One is the flexibility to run the graphical interface, different instances of the graphical interface in parallel on the same computer or in different computers, communicating with the core runtime via TCP/IP. Other advantage is performance. The tags database, the tags engine, is the main core of Studio Manager, and all the messages exchanged between the threads are driven by exception. For example, the driver can be pulling data from a PLC, and only when it reads a different value for a tag, it sends a message to the tags database with the new value, and the tags database sends this message to any other thread that is using that tag at that moment. For instance, if you are visualizing the value of that tag in a screen, the tags database sends a message to the viewer through the TCP/IP server module to update the screen. So the performance is quite high. There is no pooling among the threads, and the synchronization is automatic because they are all sharing the same tags database memory in the run memory. So now let's talk about the scope for the VBScript interfaces. In the InduSoft Web Studio development environment, we have many interfaces where you can use VBScript. So I'm going to create a new project here, like webinar VBScript. So make brand new application. And I have interfaces, like for instance here in Global. I have the global main procedures where I can write scripts using the VBScript language. If I go to graphics, I have the graphic script where I can write also scripts using the VBScript language. When I create screens, for each screen, I can click here in script and write scripts for that particular screen using the VBScript language. When I use the command animation on the object on this, I can also write scripts using the VBScript language for different events on that object. ActiveX controls and .NET controls can trigger events, and I can write scripts in VBScript language triggered by those events. And finally, here in tasks, I can create, I have the startup script group, and I can create additional groups, as many as I want, up to 10,000 groups. In each group, I can write a logic and control the execution of that group through the execution field. But each one of those groups can handle one VBScript block of code. So we have all those interfaces where I can write scripts using the standard VBScript interface. But how they connect to each other? Can I call one script from another one? Can I share variables? And this diagram pretty much answers this question. The global procedures, the top one here, which is available under global procedures, main procedures, this is a library. This is a repository of functions that you can create. So for instance, I can create here one function called my function, let's say with the argument A, and here end function. And everything that I write between the function name and the end function is the execution, is the declaration, is the content of this function. So for instance, I can say here the function my function must return the argument A times 10, a very dummy function. And I can have subroutines as well. So for instance, sub my sub, I also receive here an argument, let's say txt. I can give any name to my arguments. And when I call the sub, I call, for instance, the message box function showing the value of txt. So I can do something like the value of the argument is, and concatenate the argument txt. So in the global procedures, I can create procedures, either, here in sub, either functions or subroutines. The main difference between a function and a subroutine is the fact that the function can return a value while the subroutine does not return any value. But other than that, they are pretty much identical. They are a block of code that I can call from other interfaces. So the question is, when those functions are executed? They are executed when they are called from other interfaces in the product. So far, if I run this project, those functions will not be executed at all, because the global procedures is just a library of procedures that I can create, functions and subroutines. And where I can call those global procedures from? From any VBScript interface in the product. Anywhere where you have VBScript, you can use the function call any one of those functions. For example, I can create a new screen here and create, let's say, a button. And when I click on this button, I can use the command call to call a global procedure, and use here the name of the function I want to call, like for instance, my function, with the argument, let's say, 10. So I can save this screen as test, make this the startup screen, and run my project. So when I click this button, I execute the function, my function, but I'm not doing anything with the return from this function. So let's create a variable, for instance, the variable x. And the return of this function is written to the variable x. And I can, for instance, message box the variable x, the return from this function. So I click here, and I see 100, which is 10 times 10, which is exactly what I told my function to do. If I want to call the subroutine, all I have to do is, in any VBScript interface from the product, call my sub with the argument, like for instance, InduSoft is the argument for this one. So when I click this button, I call the subroutine, and the subroutine shows the message box, the value of the argument is InduSoft. So I can call functions and subroutines created in the global procedures from anywhere in the product. However, where the global procedures are executed? Are they executed on the server, where I have Studio Manager, or on where the viewer is running? And the answer is, depends where you call the global procedures from. If you call the global procedures from any graphical interface, here from graphics script, or from the screen script, here, or from objects on the screen. So if you call the functions from anything that you configure here in the graphics tab from InduSoft Web Studio, those functions will be executed by the viewer, not by Studio Manager. If you call those functions from the script tasks, from the startup script, or from script groups that you create here, I can right-click and create a script group like first group, for example. If I call those functions or subroutines from here, like call my function with the value 50, when InduSoft executes this code, it's going to execute the function, my function, from the background task, not from the viewer. So in this case, this function will be executed on the server where I have InduSoft Web Studio running. Talking about background tasks, all the scripts that you configure here in tasks will be executed only on the server, only by the background task, only on the station where you install InduSoft Web Studio, not on the viewer, not on the thin client interfaces. And you can create up to 10,000 groups in addition to the startup script. So this one is the first group. I can create a second one here called, for instance, second group. And in the second group, I can have a different script here. For instance, function here, trace. This is the second group. We're going to talk about the trace function in a little bit, but the trace function is a built-in function for troubleshooting. When you call this function, it executes the expression that you pass as argument for the function and writes it to the output window, as long as you right-click here and enable the trace messages. So this is the second group. I have two scripts. I have the startup script, the first group, and the second group. The startup script is executed just once and just on the server when you run the application. If you stop the application and run the application again, it is executed again. And then InduSoft keeps scanning the groups here. In this case, I have two groups, but you can have several script groups. The server, not the thin client, the background task on the server, checks the execution field from the first group. If true, executes the whole script and then checks the execution field from the second group. If true, executes the whole script and checks the next one. If there is no next one, goes back to the first one and checks the execution field. If the expression in the execution field is not true, is not a value different from 0, then it jumps that script and goes to the next one. But the scanning of those groups is synchronous, one at a time. For example, by the way, to use comments in VBScript, you can use single quotes or double slashes, and you comment out the line. So here in the first script, I can use the function trace, for instance. This is the first script. And save. So in this first script, I send to the global procedures the message. This is the first script, and on the second one, this is the second group. If I run the application, nothing happens here in the output window. Why? Because the execution field from both groups is in blank, so you are not enabling the execution of those groups. If I write 1 here, then I enable the execution of those groups. So if I save the changes, You see here that InduSoft executes the first and the second, the first and the second, the first and the second continuously, as fast as possible. If I do not want to execute a particular script all the time, I can write expressions here to control when and how often I want to execute a particular script. I've seen in some applications where customers use the system tag second, which returns the second from the computer clock, from 0 to 59. If I write seconds here, does not mean this script will be executed every second. It means this script will be executed several times during 59 seconds, and then it will not be executed when the tag second has a value 0, and then executed again for 59 seconds. If you want to execute this script every second, there are different ways you can do that. One way would be to use here the scheduler. So I can create here an event that is executed every second. Create one tag here like run script. And every second I write the value 1 to the tag run script. And here in script 1, I run this script only when the tag run script is true. Then I run my script, and then I reset the tag run script. So it will not be executed anymore until the scheduler sets this tag again 1 second later. So if I save this configuration and run the application, there you go. You can see here that the script number 2, which has, let me change here 1 for the script number 2, and in the script number 1 I have run script. So in the script number 2, which has 1 in the execution, is executed continuously, all the time. I will pause here so we can analyze it better. So script number 2 is executed continuously, several times a second. And the script number 1 is executed once a second. So that's how you can control the execution of the tasks scripts. And here is where you should configure your scripts and call functions from global procedures, keeping in mind that those scripts are executed on the server only. If you want to execute some scripts on the viewer, on the graphical interface, wherever it's running on the server or on the thin client, then we can use interfaces here in VBScript. So back to the diagram, startup scripts and the script groups are executed only on the background task. The graphics script, this interface here, is executed on the viewer, and it provides 3 functions, 3 subroutines to you. On start, while running, and on end. On start is executed on the viewer station, could be a thin client, when you open that thin client, when you start the viewer in that station. It's executed just once when you start. The while running is continuously executed while the viewer module is open. And on end is executed just once when you close the viewer module. On the screen scripts, you have similar functions, on open, while open, and on close. On open is executed just once when you open the screen. While open is continuously executed while the screen is open and only while the screen is open. And on close is executed once when you close the screen. And then the commands are executed when you click on the objects on different events here. You have on down, on while, on up, and you can have different scripts for each event. And those scripts are executed only on the viewer. Could be on the server if you're using the local viewer, or in a thin client if you're running the viewer in a web browser or a remote security or thin client. What about functions? Can I create functions in other places different from global procedures? You can. If you create functions in the global procedures, they are available for any VBScript interface in the product. But you can create your functions and subroutines here in the graphics script as well. I can create here, for instance, let's say one sub called my new test with no arguments, for instance. And in this function, I call here a message box saying this procedure was configured in the graphic script. So where I can call this function from? I can call this function from other subroutines. I can call this subroutine from other procedures within the graphic script or from any screen. For example, I can create a button here. And from this button, I can call this function. Let me just comment out. I can call this function called my new test. However, to call this function from a graphic script, you will use the prefix graphics. Dot, and then you see here my new test. I save this. So when I click on the button, it executes the subroutine from the graphical script. So you can create functions in the global procedures, and I can create functions in the graphic script as well. But to call the functions from the graphic script, you have to use the graphics dot in the name of the procedure. And global procedure functions or subroutines can be executed from anywhere, from the ones from the graphic script only on the screens. And you can declare procedures within the screens themselves. I can come here into this screen script, create my own functions here, function test, and function test from screen, and define whatever I want here. The code goes here. Now this function can be called only from this screen, not from any screen in the project, but only from this screen. And those are the interfaces where I can create procedures. There are interfaces where I can create variables as well. So here in the graphic script, I can declare variables as well. In VBScript, we use the dim word to declare variables, like dim myvar, for example. Okay? This variable now, I can call from any screen in the project, or I can use this variable from anywhere in my project, like message box, using the prefix graphics dot and here myvar. So for instance, in graphic script, I can make myvar equals to 10. And when I click this button during the runtime, I pretty much call graphics.myvar. If I stop the viewer and run again to execute here the only start, I will show the value of the variable myvar from the graphics script, the value 10. I can create variables on the screen script as well. I can come here, graphics, screen script, and variables that I create here are available within this screen only. And I can create variables on the object as well, and those variables, like DNB, will be available within this object only. So variables that you create in the graphics script is available on any screen. Variables that you create on the screen script are available on that screen only, and variables that you create on the object are available on that object only. What about the background task? Here in tasks, I can create variables in the startup script, like dim, my, VBVar, any name. And the variables that I create in the startup script can be used in any script group from the tasks. So it's a way to exchange values between different script groups, not creating tags, creating variables in the startup script. But this variable is available only for the groups, not for the screens, not for the objects. And if I create variables here within a group, like variable Z, this variable is available within that group only. So this next table here pretty much summarizes what we have discussed here. The global procedures is a library of variables in procedures that can be executed from the background task on the server or from the viewer, depends where you call this function from. And it has a global scope. Graphical scripts allows you to declare variables and procedures as well, but it's executed from the viewer only, from the graphical script, from the screen scripts, or screen controls. And if you use screen scripts or screen controls, you have to use the graphics dot prefix before calling the functions or reading the variables from the graphical scripts. Screen scripts allows you to declare variables and procedures as well, but they are executed on the viewer only, and only on the screen from that screen. You cannot declare a function in the screen A and call it from the screen B. If you want to do that, you should create this function either in the global procedures or in the graphical scripts. Screen controls allows you to declare variables but not procedures, and they're executed on the viewer. Startup scripts allows you to declare variables and procedures, and they are available only to the script groups and executed only on the server. And the script groups allows you to configure variables. They have local scope, and they're executed on the server only. So with this information in mind, now you can master procedures and variables in your application and define where you want to execute your scripts. Just recapping some basics here, we use dim to create variables and const to create constants. So for instance here, dim b, this is a variable, and when I use const, for instance c equals to 10, when I create the constant, I assign a value to this constant. So now I can use this variable in my script here, and if I want to change the value of this constant, I just change once here in the declaration, and I do not have to change my whole script, my whole function. In order to call procedures, typically you can use the call command, it's a subroutine, or you can just return the value from the function to a tag or a variable. But there are some important information about the arguments. Like for instance here in my function, I take the variable a and I multiply this variable a by 10. So let's make a quick test here. I create a variable called b in the button, and I make, for instance, I call the function my function, and I pass b as the argument. So let's make b equal to 50, right? And let's take the results here. Oh, that's fine. So I call the function with the value 50. Now, if I message box the value of the variable b, let's see what it returns to us. So let me make here a equals to 8 times 10, and I return 8. Change a little bit the function. So let's see how it works. I create the variable b, I set the variable b to 50, and I pass this value as an argument for this function. Within the function, I multiply the argument by 10 and return the value. Right? But now let's see what is the value of the variable b, the argument for the function. If I click on the button, the value is 500. What it shows us is that the variable b is passed as reference for the function. I can change the value of this variable inside this function, and when the function returns, it returns also a new value to this argument, whatever the value of this argument within the function. If I do not want to change the value of my variable b when returning the function, I can declare that this argument is passed by value, using here the keyword by val. So if I do that and click on the button, now the variable b remains with the original value 50. So now instead of passing the variable b to the function, I'm passing the value 50 to the function. So the variable b does not change of value in this script before calling the function. So it's an important concept. You can also write here by ref, which is the default, pass the variable by reference. So if you do not write anything by default, you are passing the arguments by reference. And in InduSoft, you have IntelliSense. So we do support all the functions from VBScript, all the statements, the keywords from VBScript. But in addition to that, you can also use built-in functions from InduSoft and tags from InduSoft in the VBScript interface. And all you have to do is use the $, and InduSoft shows the list of all functions, built-in functions from InduSoft with this icon, and all tags from your application using different icons for different data types, just like in this slide here. So that's how you can call InduSoft functions or InduSoft tags from any VBScript interface. Just use the syntax $, and type and select the tag or InduSoft function you want to call from the VBScript interface. Troubleshooting tools. Trace function we have discussed already. Whenever you call the trace function, InduSoft executes the expression passed as argument for the trace function and shows this information on the output window, as long as you enable here in the output window to show the trace messages. I can unpause here. It keeps sending messages here to the output window. VBScript message box we have used many times already. In some cases, you want InduSoft to show the message box. It's just like a breakpoint. It stops the script right there, shows a message to you, and then if you say OK, then it continues the execution of the script. And there are some techniques to handle errors within VBScript. For example, let's create another example here. I create a variable a here, and I make a equals to 10 divided by 0. It's clearly a bad expression, right? We cannot have division by 0. And after I do that, I show here message box, hello, for example. I'm going to disable trace message here to avoid showing too many messages and delete. So let's click on this button and see what happens. I click the button and InduSoft shows an error saying on this screen, on the object 5, I did a division by 0. And that's fine. It tells you that there is a problem. But by default, when VBScript finds an error like this one, it throws the error and it stops that script right there. In some cases, you want to continue the execution of the script even if it fails. So in order to do that, you can use the syntax on error, go to next, execute the portion that could throw an error, and then on error, go to 0 when you are done on the portion of your script that might throw VBScript errors. In this case, we know for sure that it's going to throw an error, but if you are dividing by a tag value or something like that, if you're dividing by a variable value, you don't know up front if it's going to throw an error or not. And division by 0 is just one example. There are many other situations that could throw errors, especially when you use external objects, ActiveX controls. So on error go to next and on error go to 0. Tells the script to continue the script and pretty much ignore the error. So let me just, on error, resume next, sorry. On error, resume next, on error, go to 0. So I can say, by the way, this is another good thing about the VBScript interface in InduSoft. If you have a syntax error, it warns you and does not allow you to save the script unless the syntax is correct. So if I click now, I see the message, hello. It still threw an error dividing by 0 here, but it continued the execution of this script. And if I want to check if there is an error or not, I can do here use the variable ERR, is an internal keyword from VBScript, dot number. If there is an error, this ERR dot number will be different from 0. It's an error code. And then I can use the internal variable ERR dot description to show the actual message from the error. So let's see how it works. I click on the button and I see the error division by 0. That's the value of the variable ERR.description when ERR.number is different from 0. So just some techniques to handle errors in VBScript and make sure that your script is completed, is fully executed, even if you have errors. I assume that most people here are quite familiar with VBScript, but I just put together here some basic statements like the if-then statement. That's the simplest way, is what we call the inline statement to check conditions. So the syntax is if, expression with the condition, the word then, and the actions that should be executed if this condition is true. And true is any value different from 0. So if my var is equal to 10, then I will show the message box my var value is 10. If I want to execute more than one action, then I cannot use the inline statement here. I have to use then, hit enter, write my statements in the next lines, and then finish the statement with int if. For example, something like this. Then A, and I can say A equals to 10, and here if A is greater than 5, then, and my code comes here if I have more than one line, and then int if. If it is just one expression, just one action, I can use the inline statement. Optionally, I can use the else. So if then, in the next line, the action or actions, in the next line, else, and then the actions that should be executed if the condition is not true, and then int if. We can also use nested if statements. If this condition is true, then I execute this. If not, then I check another condition. And if true, I execute this. And if not, then I execute something else. So you can keep nesting the if statements as is illustrated here. But in most cases, when you have to do something like that, the select case is a more efficient and elegant way to check different conditions, as long as they are associated to the same variable. So in this case here, the syntax is select case in the variable that you want to analyze, either variable or tag or expression. And then you write one case line for each possible value of this variable or expression that would draw a different action. So in this case 10, in other words, if my var has the value 10, I show the message box my var value is 10. Case 20, if my var has the value 20, then I show the next message. And you can optionally use case else to show, to trigger an action if neither one of the previous case values are the actual value of the variable. And then int select. Those are the basic conditional statements from VBScript. You have also looping statements. The most common one is the for next loop, when you know upfront how many times you want to execute a specific loop. And optionally, by default, if I do, for instance, for id equals to 1 to 10, the first, when it goes into the loop, it writes the value 1 to the variable id, and executes this loop until id is or greater than the value 10. And it increments id one by one on each iteration of this loop. You can optionally use here a step and a number. So each time that the loop is executed, it increments, in this case, the id variable in 2 units instead of 1. And you can have negative values in the step as well, if the initial value is lower than the final value, is greater than the final value. For each next is a statement if you have a collection of items like an array, then you can say for each item in this array, do something. So in this case, since my array has 3 elements, my var 1, 2, and 3, this loop will interact 3 times. Each time it writes the value of the array, of the first array index, and then the second array index, and then the third array index to the tag item. And in this case, I would show this information on the output window using the trace function. Do loops. The do loop statement allows you to loop for an unknown, or at least for an undefined number of times. For instance, if you want to loop until a condition happens or while a condition is true, then you can use the do loop statement. You have 4 variations. First, you have do while loop and do loop while. The first one executes this loop only while this condition is true. And the main difference between this one and the second one here is that in the second one, you execute the loop at least once, for sure. And then you check the condition, and while this condition is true, we keep executing the loop. So in the first one, if the condition is not true, you might not execute this loop even once. In the second case, you execute once for sure, and you might execute other times if the as long as the condition is true. The do until, in this case here, we check this condition, and while this condition is false, we keep executing the loop. When this condition is true, then we stop executing the loop. In this one, we execute the loop at least once, and as long as this condition is false, we keep executing the loop. When this condition is true, we stop executing the loop. So the basic looping statement supported by VBScript. I put together here a list of built-in functions from VBScript, and there are many other functions, and I'll show a full reference in a few minutes here. But those are the functions that I would say are used more often. And you can use them in any VBScript interface from InduSoft just by typing the function name, like date add, open parentheses, and InduSoft shows the IntelliSense. So first the interval, then the number, and then the date, for example. And this function is going to return one date, let's do in date, 1 date, 10 days in advance from today. So if I message box the value of this function and click on the button, it shows March 10th, which is today plus 10 days. So you can use any function from VBScript in the InduSoft Web Studio just by typing the function name. And if you want to use a built-in function from InduSoft, not from VBScript, you just use the $prefix. There are several built-in functions from InduSoft that are useful to control the execution of procedures as well, like the run global procedure on server. So just like in this example here, I'm calling, for instance, this function mySub. So this function, the way it is configured right now, will be executed on the viewer. And if I click this button in a thin client, this function mySub, this subroutine mySub, will be executed on the thin client. If I want to click on the button on the thin client but execute this function on the server, I can use the InduSoft built-in function, run global procedure on server. The first argument is the name of the procedure I want to execute from the global procedure, and then the parameters, if any, for the function. So now with this statement, when I click the button, even though I'm clicking the button on the viewer, this function will be executed on the server, not on the thin client. So it's very useful in some situations. And this function, run global procedure async, is very useful when you have scripts here on the server that needs to be executed eventually. For example, generate one report on the shift. But that script might take a long time to be executed. Maybe you have to retrieve a lot of data from the database and save thousands of lines in a report, and it might take several seconds. So if you call a function that takes too much time just using the call statement, these scripts will execute the function, but while this group is executing that function, the other script groups are not being executed because they are synchronous. So instead, you can use the function run global procedure async and define here the name of the function you want to execute, the arguments, if any. And when the background task executes this function, it creates a new thread on the fly. It starts executing this function in an individual thread and continues the execution of the other scripts. So you do not pause, you do not freeze that thread while that script is being executed. Just be careful not to call this function too many times in a short period of time, because every time you call this function, we start a thread, and if you call this function again, even before the thread was finished, we're going to create another thread. So if you call this function, let's say every second you can create too many threads on the system and eventually use all the resources from your computer. So it's very useful, but it has to be used properly. Now I'd like just to, we are almost wrapping here, demonstrate how to interface with SQL relational databases using the InduSoft built-in functions in the VBScript interface from InduSoft. So I'm going to use Microsoft SQL Server here just because I have the database in my computer, but does not have to be Microsoft SQL Server. Could be pretty much any other database. Could be Oracle, Sybase, MySQL, any other database. So let's create a brand new database here. I'm going to call, let's say, webinar. So it's a brand new catalog here. I do not have any tables, so it's brand new. Now, and this is the SQL Server engine. If I want to link InduSoft to this database, first I have to come here to Tasks and right-click in Connections to create a new connection. And I give a name, an alias to this connection, like DB, for example. Here in Connection String, I link InduSoft to the database, like SQL Server. Here is the server where the database is running, could be a remote computer, and select a database from that server, in our case, the webinar database. That connection, the connection succeeded. Now I have this connection called DB, linking InduSoft to that particular database. And now it's very simple. If I want to interact with that database, I can create, for instance, a variable here and write a SQL statement in this variable. Like, for instance, create table, my table, the columns C1, which is an integer, and C2, which is an integer. And then execute the function db execute, connecting with the connection db, and the second argument is the SQL statement that should be executed. And this is pretty much it. So let me change the label here of the button, indicating this is the button that creates the table. So during the runtime, if I click here, InduSoft executes the create table statement using this function db execute. So if I go back to the database, now I have the table, my table, with the columns C1 and C2. So using this function db execute, I can execute any SQL statement supported by the database. Like, for instance, let's create one button here to insert values. So I can create another variable here, for instance, ID, and say for ID equals to 1 to 10, Next, I create a SQL statement saying insert into my table values. And here I insert first the value of ID and comma and insert ID times 10, for example, times 100. So it's going to be the values in the second column are 100 times the values in the first column. And execute these statements, let's say 10 times. Let's do it less, let's say just 5 times, for example. Okay? So we save here. If I click on this button, InduSoft shows here in the output window that I have a syntax error. Pretty much, I had a typo there. I had to concatenate using the %. So let's clear this error and click on the button again. So no errors here. So if I go back to the database and open this table, I have there the 5 values for the column 1 and column 2. So just by creating the SQL statements and using the VBExecute function, I can create tables, drop tables, insert values, update values, delete values. I can execute any SQL relational SQL statement supported by the SQL relational database. Even call store procedures, execute store procedures. So back to the diagram, I use mainly the VBExecute function to insert data, delete data from the database. What if I want to query? I want to read information from the database. Then there is another set of functions, simple functions, that we can create to read data from the database. So let's create here a button to select values. And if I come here to commands, I can create some additional variables here like row, num rows, num cur. And then first I create my SQL statement. So in this case it's going to be select everything from my table, which is the name of my table here. Now to execute this function, I use to execute these statements, I use the InduSoft built-in function dbCursorOpen, where I define first the name of the connection I want to use, and then the SQL statement. In this function, we reads the data from the database, keeps this information in memory, and returns a handle that I can use to access this information in memory, to access this data set read from the database in the run memory. If I want to know how many rows were retrieved by the function, I can use dbCursor row count, pointing to this handle. Then I can say for row equals to 1 to the number of rows returned, create a loop to read all the values from this data set. So I can create a variable, for instance, called txt, and here I have txt is equal to, let's do txt and dbCursor get value, where I define go to this data set, return the values from the column C1. And then I concatenate the values with, for instance, the tab, a tab character, retrieve the value from the column C2, and go to the next line, char return line feed. So I'm concatenating value to this variable txt, and on each interaction of this loop, I can use the dbCursor next to go to the next record in the data set. Very important. When I'm done with my data, I have to execute the function dbCursorClose to destroy this information from memory, to release this data set from memory. If you keep calling the function dbopen to create this information in memory and do not call the close to release it, you will have a memory leaking and eventually you will not have resources anymore because you keep adding information to the memory and you never release it. So remember to call the function DB cursor close whenever you are done with the information after calling the DB cursor open. Oh, and by the way, after everything, I can message box the variable txt. So let's see what happens. I click here, InduSoft retrieves the data from the database and shows the values on the screen. In the past webinar, I was asked, what if I want to dump this information to a file? It's very simple. For instance, a CSV file. Instead of using VB tab here, I use comma to separate the values. And at the end of each interaction, I use, for instance, the function file write to write this information to a file, like c10 seconds webinar.csv. Write here the value from the txt, appending the value on each interaction. And this is pretty much done. So if I do this now, save, and click here, select values, InduSoft executes this script, and if I open this file, let me type the correct file name. If I open this file, for instance, with Excel or Notepad, I would see the values that InduSoft selected from the database and dumped into the CSV file. So it's that simple to read data from a database and manipulate in any way you want. You can dump to a CSV file, you can write to tags, you can show a message box, you can trigger alarms just by using this set of simple functions. And you can call it from anywhere, from the viewer, from the background tasks in the VBScript, in any VBScript interface from InduSoft. Just to wrap here, the last slide, it's very simple to interface with ActiveX controls and .NET controls as well using VBScript. Like for instance, in scripts, I can go to ActiveX controls here, select any ActiveX control from my list, for instance, Microsoft Web Browser. So let's place it somewhere here on the screen. I'll make a little bit larger, move this button there. Okay, so I place this ActiveX control somewhere here in my screen, and if I double click here on the ActiveX control or .NET control and go to configuration, I see the list of events from the control, and if this control calls any event, I can write a script here in VBScript to be executed whenever the ActiveX control calls those events. And for properties and methods of ActiveX controls, I can just give a name to the control, like MB, my browser, for example, and then create a button here. Let's say here, website. And the syntax is very simple. The name you gave to the control, like MB, dot, and you see here all the properties and methods from the controls. The purple icons are methods, the green icons are properties. And I can call, for instance, the method navigate to from this ActiveX, and the first argument is the URL, like google.com, for example. And I can create another button, for example, for, let's say, a PDF, and I call the same method, but now I go to a different path here in my computer, get product path, go to the DRV subfolder, and to the file multicp.pdf, for example. So during the runtime, if I click in website, it executes the navigate to method with the Google URL, and I show the Google website within the screen. And if I click in PDF, it executes the other URL for the PDF document and shows the document on the screen. So it's that simple to interact with ActiveX controls just by using the name of the ActiveX control, dot, and the name of the properties or methods from the ActiveX control. Clone servers. there are several home servers available in your Windows platform. For example, there is one interface here called sapi.spvoice that is used from Windows to do text-to-speech. So you pretty much pass a text, and it translates, it reads this text and speaks it out on the speakers from your computer. So for instance, I can create a variable here called OV, for example, object voice. Then to link this variable, which is going to be an object, with a COM server, use the syntax set, name of the variable, equals to create object, is a function from VBScript, and the name of the COM server you want to link to this variable, like sapi.spvoice. What you're doing here in reality is create an object called OV, which is an instance from this COM server. Now I can call methods from this object, like it has a method called speak, and here I say the text I wanted to speak. Like for instance, this is a text. And when I'm done, I can set this object to nothing to release it from memory. And this is pretty much done. So let's save. Let me change here the caption to text to speech. And if I click on this button,
this is a text.
Hopefully you can read it kind of low volume.
This is a text.
But when I click on the button, I read from the speakers, this is a test, which is actually this COM server from Microsoft executing the speak method with this argument, and I'm calling it from the VBScript interface from InduSoft Web Studio. So just before wrapping up, I'd like to give you additional references for VBScript. One is the InduSoft Web Studio Technical Reference Manual. If you go to Help, under Help here, there is a topic here in Contents for VBScript, and it's a whole topic talking only about VBScript. All the statements, all the functions. Here in Tips and Tricks, it covers most of the information, or pretty much all information we discussed today, logical operators, looping through code. There are several examples. So it's a great source of reference for VBScript. There is also the MSDN library. And there is this website, W3 Schools, which has a very nice tutorial going step by step with many examples and list of all the VBScript functions, for example. And you can select any function here, like for instance, format, date, and time. And it shows the syntax for the function and several examples. So it's a nice source of information and reference for VBScript as well. Having said that, I'd like to open for Q&A, and you can write your questions in the chat box or Q&A box. So one question was about different types of databases like MySQL and Oracle. They are fully supported by InduSoft Web Studio. Any SQL relational database that supports ODBC, AGO, or ODB. One question is if the global procedures is only to define functions and subroutines. That's correct. The global procedures is just a library of functions and subroutines, and you can call those functions or subroutines from any other VBScript interface in the product. How global procedures work if I call from the viewer and server? It's going to be executed potentially at the same time by different processes. Remember that the viewer is one process running parallel from the server, so if you call the same function from both places, it will be executed potentially simultaneously on the server by Studio Manager and on the viewer by the viewer module, and that's perfectly fine. Can you show a simple example how to show values from the database in a grid object? Sure, it's not really the topic of the webinar, but it's very simple. So I can just copy here the connection string, which is the link for this database. So if I go to Project Options, Database, I can use the same connection string here. And now on the screen, I can create a grid object. Let me make some room here. I'll delete some of those buttons just to make some room for the grid control. And here in the grid control, I define the data source database. Here in the data source settings, I browse the table, my table. And here in columns, I define the columns I want to display, like C1 and C2 as numeric values. Save it, run it. InduSoft goes to the database, retrieves the values, and show the values on the grid. And in this case, you do not even need VBScript. It's all built in the grid control. Another question is, I did not have an INT-IF on the if-then statement. Is it necessary to have an INT-IF? It is necessary to have an INT-IF only if you have more than one action to be executed if the then is true. So again, I can have a simple statement here saying, for instance, then A equals to 10. If A equals to 10, then message box A. So in this case, I do not need a INT-IF because it is what we call an inline statement. If I want to have an else statement, or even if I want to do two different things here, like message box A and make A equal to 0, then I need to have a INT-IF statement. Does the variables created in VBScript affect the number of these, tags available in the application? No. InduSoft license does not count the number of VBScript variables that you create, and it does not affect the license. We do not limit in any fashion. However, keep in mind that whenever you create a new variable in VBScript, this variable uses memory in the run memory. So if you create, let's say, 1 million variables in VBScript, keep in mind that you will need run memory for those 1 million variables. But it's not controlled by the InduSoft license, and it does not affect the number of tags. Another question is where you can get this presentation. Today yet or early tomorrow morning, we'll send an email to everybody with a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and in a couple of days, we will publish this video on the InduSoft website. Is there a difference between calling an ActiveX on the client or on the server? Good question. You can call the ActiveX control. First of all, if we're talking about the ActiveX controls, it's a graphical element, right? It's something you place on the screen here. So when you use ActiveX controls on the screen, they are always handled and executed by the viewer module. Could be the viewer module running on the server where you have the Studio Manager, or could be the viewer module running on a thin client. And you can execute on the thin client as well, as long as that ActiveX control is registered in the web thin client station. Let's see a few other questions here. Does Microsoft support VBScript? VBScript is still supported even in the most current operating systems from Microsoft, including Windows 7. When Microsoft stops supporting it, I'm not aware of any plans to stop supporting the VBScript engine on the new operating systems from Microsoft. It might happen in the future, but there are still many applications based on VBScript, and I'm sure before it happens, just like everything else in the product, we will provide you a migration path to whatever is available in the future. But for the time being and foreseeable future, VBScript is, and I believe will remain supported on all Microsoft platforms.
One question is if we can interface with the InduSoft proprietary database with VBScript. The answer is yes, using a COM server installed by InduSoft called Studio HST server. And if you go to the InduSoft website, here InduSoft.com, under Support, Sample Applications, there is one example here for, I think it was not uploaded yet, but we are uploading also along with this video one demo called Studio HST server. And in this example, I show how to, we pretty much provide one function created in VBScript, which allows you to read information from the InduSoft HST files and manipulate this data. In the example, we save to a CSV file, but you can do anything with it. Is it possible to tell in VBScript that a tag alarm is enabled or not? Actually, there is, and using the low statements just like anywhere else. So you can come here. You can use here the syntax $, tag name like seconds, dash greater than, high, low, high, low, low, just like anywhere else. And can one animate directly from VBScript? The InduSoft animations like color or bar graph and so on and so forth are driven by tags. However, you can create a VBScript to manipulate the values, and eventually when you want to animate the object like change color or the bar graph, you just set a tag that changes the tags used on those animations. So with that, we covered the questions so far. If you have additional questions, feel free to contact me directly or send emails to support@indusoft.com or even call us. And I'd like to finish thanking everybody, sending a great thank you to everybody, and I expect to see you again in the next webinar.